Chapter 17. Ever since he was at the convent, Eirik had been used to wake at the time when the brethren rose to go to matins. And he did the same now when he slept in Eldred's arms. Now the caller passed through the dormitory whispering, "Benedicamus Domino," and the friars answered softly, "Deo gratias," as they slipped from their pallets. He himself had been one of those who filed quietly down into the bright choir to sing the hymn of praise at daybreak. He himself had knelt and prayed from the first faint streak of dawn until the sun ruled in all its power and all men had gone to their labour. And now he had strayed hither, and what this woman had taught him was such that he felt a blast of the heat of hell. And yet he thought, with a strange rigour of pain, what had befallen him was a destiny that had been laid upon him from his birth, and now it was accomplished. More and more clearly he felt the familiarity of this forest wilderness. It had all been in his dream, even the little cornfield with the withered bush fence about it. In his dream he had ridden the bay horse when Lehman came flying on her broad blue wings, plucked him from his horse, and flung herself upon him with the wild hot caresses that terrified him. And now she had him under her wings, had beak and claws in him, struck at his heart, and drank his life-blood. He knew of no return. This time he could not tear himself away from Lehman and fly as in his dream. He had no strength for that now. Of the women he had possessed, she was the first he loved, and the first who had desired him, and not a penny in reward. And then to ride away from her one day and leave her alone, deserted and in want, that he could never bring himself to do. And in the midst of his misfortune it dawned upon him, this was not the end. He had been drawn down into evil before, but he had been saved. His feet had been set on the firm rock, and he had been made a freer man than before. And he who had saved him then would save him again. From his destiny no man can fly, but above his destiny is God. And so in what had befallen him, it could not have been designed that Lehman should strike her beak into his heart and drink him dry and empty, but he began to think he might be called to set free Lehman from her semblance. It had lasted for more than a week. He continued to work for Eldred in the daytime, and he had become acquainted with his three housemates, the hag, the herd boy, and Holgeir, Eldred's old kinsman. They seemed not to be surprised. Folk were not likely to be surprised at anything with Eldred. Nor was he himself surprised, somehow. All that time between his childhood in the forest and the present, when the forest had recaptured him, seemed like a dream. Once or twice he had taken bows and arrows. The house was well furnished with arms. When he asked Eldred who was their owner, she merely answered, "I." Then he went hunting. He came home toward noon on the 10th day after Guttorm's visit to the Ness, bringing Eldred 2 wood-grouse. Then he asked her abruptly, with no beating about the bush, "Will you marry me, Eldred?" Eldred gave a little laugh. No, I will not." "Why not?" "Do you know how many men I have had?" she asked mockingly. "Scarce so many, I warrant, as that Mary of Magdala." "Is that your aim? You may spare yourself the trouble, Eirik. A monk, too, I have had. When I made him go the way I would, he was the worst of all." "Yes, that is likely enough," said Eirik, "since he had broken a holy vow. But no one can say that of me. It must be held that Gunhild has released me from all oaths and promises." Eldred had dropped her work and stood staring at her young lover. "Well, how had you thought this would end?" asked Eirik. "Oh, some I drove away when I grew tired of them. Others got tired of me first and went of themselves. Which it will be with you I have not yet thought." "Eldred," said Eirik, "I have seen it in your eyes every time I took the bow and went into the woods. You were afraid I should not come back." She stared at him, red and speechless. But then she broke out, "Afraid? Ah, yes, it is true. And do you think I am afraid to be afraid? Did you know I learnt what it is to be afraid while you were yet sucking on your mother's breasts? Afraid?" Eldred's great eyes flashed. "Take yourself off, little lad, when you want, and go back to saying your hours and creeping to the cross and doing penance, but not for me. I prayed the day I rode as a bride to Harold's house. The storm came upon us on the way. I prayed God to send his lightning and save me. I prayed Virgin Mary to take me in her keeping. I too was a virgin of 14 years, as she was when the angel visited her. I prayed her send the angel with the flaming sword and save me. It had struck the great ash in Castle Cleft. We saw the marks of the lightning in the grass as we rode up. But there was no mercy for me. And you talk to me of being afraid." She stalked hither and thither in the little room. "You say afraid to me. I think it would scarce scare you from your wits were I to tell you all the vengeance I took upon Harold with his own housecarls before his eyes, while he lay palsied and speechless. That might have been enough. The rest I have regretted, maybe was stupid, not worth the pains. After Harold was dead and his children had driven me out, I dwelt at Sigurdstad, wasting myself and my estate. But I rejoice whenever I recall Harold, as he lay there babbling and glaring." Eldred stood facing Eirik, with a sneer on her dry brown lips. "Go! You are afraid of me now, milksop, puny creature that you are. Your face is grey and white as a flock of wool." Eirik shook his head. "I am not afraid." He smiled faintly. "And I mean to stay here and be married to you." Some evenings later, when old Holgeir was with them in the room, Eirik said to him, "I have asked Eldred if she will marry me. She is a widow and can dispose of herself, but it were better she acted in accord with one of her kinsmen. Therefore I now ask you." Holgeir answered that if Eirik would make him a promise in the presence of witnesses that he should remain here in the same condition, even if Eldred took a husband, he would give his consent. To this Eirik agreed. When Holgeir had gone out, he turned to Eldred. "Say yes. It will be tiresome both for you and me to be talking forever of the same thing." Eldred replied hotly, "You are like the witless beasts, Eirik, like a horse or a steer. It is vain to try to save them from the fire. They run straight back into the flames." "May I take that for consent?" asked Eirik with a little laugh. "Take it for what you will." Then he sold to Holgeir the silver chain with a cross on it, which he had worn round his neck under his clothes since he was a boy, and bought meal and malt. Eldred brewed and baked, and they killed a calf. She made preparations for the betrothal feast with a gloomy air and strange words. But every time he held her in his arms, he knew why she was thus. It was because he now had power over her. She still thought this marriage was madness, but she could not lose him. One night she asked him, What will you do with me when you go back home to Hestviken? It is not sure it will ever be ours to dwell there, so long as father lives, said Eirik. But you have had a greater manor than that under you before now. She was so thin when he pressed her to him that it made him think of grouse he had sometimes shot. They had once been winged, but had lived on and supported themselves in a fashion long after. Just before marrying then, Eirik invited the neighbours to a feast, and then he went off to the parish priest at Sarnes church. Eirik had lent Holgeir his bay horse, and he himself walked behind with the two peasants from the little farms up in the woods. Holgeir was spokesman. Eirik gave his name and his father's name and his home parish. Sire John promised to publish the banns of marriage in lawful manner, and he also promised to come to the betrothal feast. It was held 3 days before Knut's Mass, and all went well. Eirik betrothed Eldred with his ring. For surety's sake he turned his words so as to say, "I take you to wife," so that he might be sure the marriage was now made, since he had already lived with the woman. Eldred used the same form of words in her response. Sire John then said some prayers, blessed them with holy water, blessed the company and the food. The feast passed off right well. The poor peasants who were witnesses seemed to have known but little of their neighbour before now, but they made good cheer at her table. The priest was allotted the high seat. Now that he and his 2 assistants had removed their white vestments, he grew very talkative and very cheerful. He was himself the son of a poor peasant of the neighbouring parish, and he had often been at the Ness in his childhood, for it was of his aunt's husband that Benedict Bursesson had bought the farm for his sister. He boasted greatly of what the Ness had been in those days, and gave Eirik good advice as to what he ought to do now that he was to be master here, at the same time enjoining him to show gratitude to God for having been raised to such prosperity. It dawned on Eirik that the priest took him to be a man of nothing, who had taken service here and was now to get a farm and a wife who came of great folk, though she was somewhat the worse for wear. All the guests thought the same. They had seen him working here in a rough frock that Eldred had made for him, and shoes of raw hide that he had made for himself. No one but Eldred and Holgeir knew more of him than that. This roused all his old love of giving play to his fancy. He grew very free, and said not a word that might lead any of them to suspect the truth, but talked and behaved as though he were a poor serving man, who was now being received into the ranks of landowners. The priest said among other things that nowhere in the land was better fish to be found than in this lake, especially the perch. Eirik promised to render his fishing tithes well and duly, and said that if one day he caught some fine perch in his nets, he would bring the priest a little present. The banns had been called twice for Eirik and Eldred. But one morning during the week before the 3rd time of asking, Eirik had a great catch of fine fish in his nets, and so he thought he would now fulfil his promise to the priest and bring him some fresh fish for the fast day. He strung the biggest of the perch together, took his horse, and rode off. But no sooner had he entered the door of the priest's house than Sire John came to him, looking as if the eyes would start from his head. He took the string of fish and flung it away as though it were a string of vipers. "Man of ill omen! You have befooled me abominably and made sport of me. You are none other than the only son of Olav Audunsson of Hestviken." He waved his hands in dismay. "No, sire, have I befooled you? I told you my name and my father's name, and where I came from." "Yes, Eirik and Olaf. There are many of those names." "Then I sent word to your parish priest to know if you were unmarried, and in no affinity to the woman, and this is what I hear. Yes, but you cannot possibly have heard of any lawful hindrance. His only son, besides, and heir to an estate, and you will be married to Eldred Bertesdatter. Yes, smiled Eirik, since I hold myself to be an equal mate for her. At this Sire John exclaimed that never in this world would he say their bridal mass, nor would he publish the banns the third time. That you have no right to refuse us, Sire. Ah, yes, I know you have had your nose inside a convent, and have smelt at the books they had there. You may complain to Dean Peter, or to the bishop, if you dare. All that Eirik could say was of no avail. That he had long been of full age, and that Eldred was a widow, and had betrothed herself to him by the counsel of a kinsman, and that their cohabitation was already binding marriage by the law of the Church, and could not be dissolved without mortal sin. And since neither Olaf nor Bert were sheep of his flock, he could not see why the priest was so afraid of them. It was all of no use, even when he tried to tempt Sire John, promising him to remember him when once he was Master of Hestviken. So nothing came of the wedding. Eirik cared little, since Eldred seemed not to take it to heart. What had been done was enough to satisfy the law of God, according to which they were husband and wife, and what view the law of the land might take of their cohabitation mattered little, as yet in any case. But his talk with the priest had nevertheless forced him to remember that there was a world outside the Ness on Longwater. And one day, in the course of the autumn, he told his wife that he would have to ride home and see his father. The morning he set out, Eldred accompanied him a little way across the marshes. "Do not look at me like that," he said with an embarrassed smile as they parted. "I shall be home again by the evening of the third day at the latest, and it may well be that I shall come sooner." It was past midday when he came out by the river mouth and saw once more the bay and the fjord outside and the rust-coloured rocks by the shore. He had ridden through the fields. They had finished cutting the corn here, and the cattle were loose in the paddocks. He knew every beast, and he knew every foot of ground. There was not a bush or a heap of stones or a tussock in the meadow that he had not gone round with scythe and billhook. And yet he did not feel at home here any longer, in the way he was at home at the Ness, at the farm where he was always coming upon corners that were unknown to him, on the lake to the farther end of which he had never yet rode, in the woods around where he was always striking tracks that led he knew not whither. And yet wherever he went, he had the feeling that here he had been born and brought up, that he had seen it all before, either when he was a child or in his dreams. As his horse's hoofs struck the rocks of the yard, Ragnar came to the door of the cookhouse. She cried aloud and ran toward him. Then others of the housefolk came out and swarmed about him, and last came Cecilia with the little child on her arm. It gave Eirik a shock to realize that it was Audun, and that he had not grown much since he last saw him. It was not yet a year since that day in the storehouse loft. Then he saw his father come to the door of the house. Olaf stood there a moment, looked at his son, then turned in again. Eirik kissed his silent sister on the lips. "I will come in to you when I have spoken with father." He followed Olaf into the living room. His father sat in his seat. Eirik remained standing by the door with his hat in his hands. "I have come home, father." "Yes, I am growing used to that now." "No, father. I know you have good reason to chide me for leaving home without warning and staying away so long." Olaf interrupted him. "A vagabond you are, and never will there be anything of you but a vagabond and a bird of passage. I make no complaint. It is your nature. I was a fool to believe, time after time, that each new whimsy would last. I believed you when you said you would be a monk. I believed you when you said you would live at Saltviken and restore the farm there. I believed you when you thought you had set your heart on Gunhild Berseldatter. But one thing I did not believe of you, that you would take so paltry a revenge on Bers, as when you went off and debauched his daughter, who was so situated that you knew no man would defend her. I am married to Eldred, father. As his father made no reply, Eirik said again, I thought you had heard that, since our priest had to make inquiry about me here in my own parish. I heard of it, but I thought you would act according to your wont, as like as not, as when you were to take your vows in the convent. But it falls worst on yourself. God knows how you will carry it on the day when you begin to feel galled by a bond which cannot be broken. Eirik stood still, looking at his father. Again he seemed to be wondering. All that his father said was true enough, and yet he knew that the truth was otherwise. I do not blame her, said Olaf bitterly. I would not have done what Bers did, given away a fair young child to an oldster who had buried 2 wives already. And an ugly sight he was, with the big white bumps on his skull grinning out of his tousled hair, and never have I heard that he did a kindness to man or woman. Maybe other wives would have transgressed as much as Eldred, had they not lacked the courage. And naturally she was ready to marry you, if she could bring it about. For all that, I will not have such a woman established in your mother's seat here, or taking precedence of your sister here at Hestviken, not while I am master. When I am dead or unfit to have control, then you may come back, and then it may be more honourable that you bring with you the wife you have chosen, rather than thrust her into a corner, if you have not done so already before that time comes. But until then, you two must keep away from my domains. As you will, father. No, I do not mean it that way, said Olaf curtly, that I would drive you from home. You may stay here as long as you wish. I suppose you will fetch such things as are yours, visit kinsfolk and friends. I will not deny you that. Nor that you come hither to visit your sister. But you must come alone. But dwell here you shall not again in my time. I am tired of this. No sooner do we think you are settled somewhere than we have you back. And when we think you mean to stay at home, of a sudden you are gone. But put off your cloak now, said his father, as he would speak to any other guest, and take your rest. Cecilia had ordered food and ale to be brought to her house for her brother. Jorund had gone to Gunnarsby to see his brothers, she said. They talked together first of her children. All 3 were thriving, and then of the manor and the summer, and of folk they knew, but not of his affairs. Eirik asked whether Jorund and their father were on better terms now. They are not at enmity, replied the wife. She turned red. He has begun to do more on the farm. Jorund has not had his baleful headache so much this summer. Father talks of moving out to Saltviken, she added, letting Jorund have charge here. Eirik lifted Kolbein onto his knees. You know, he said quietly, my wife has never had a child, and now she is not so young either. I had it in my mind to tell you this, so you may know, you and Jorund, if you are now to take over all the work here, 'Tis most likely that this little lad will one day have Hestviken after me." "Eirik, that you could undo yourself in this way," said Cecilia in a horrified whisper. "It is not as you think," replied Eirik, and what shocked his sister most was that she could not read the expression in his eyes. It was not one of sorrow or remorse. Eirik took his departure late in the afternoon of the third day. He had packed a saddle-bag with such of his things as he needed most. More he would have sent after him, for he was to ride home alone, and he could lead no pack-horse with him. There was no fodder for more than one horse at the Ness. But Gisti, one of his old dogs, he would have with him. It had followed its master's heels wherever he went these 3 days, jumping up at him whenever he snapped his fingers. He was glad, for he felt the want of a dog at the Ness. Cecilia wished to ride with him part of the way. She could then see to her child at Ringel at the same time. His father said farewell to Eirik in the yard. They parted kindly, but Eirik knew that from now on he was a stranger here. Brother and sister rode inland together. Knut Ragnarsson, who was now Cecilia's henchman, followed at a distance. As they passed Rundmere, Eirik asked Cecilia to take care of Olav Audunsson, the sick lad. "He is fit to do a little woman's work," Cecilia promised. They came to where the road branched off to Ringel. Eirik did not wish to go and meet his kinsfolk there, so they took leave of each other. He had dismounted. His sister laid her hand on his head, forcing it sharply into her lap. "Eirik, Eirik," she whispered despairingly. "It is as though they would draw you back to Elfland." Eirik gently freed himself. "What fancies! I am content with the lot that has fallen to me." It was dark when he reached the end of the lake. The Ness stood out black against the pale surface of the water. He made out a figure walking toward him on the road. Eirik leapt from his horse. "Here I am, Eldred." She did not take his hand. He heard her breathing heavily, and then she burst into tears. She sat down at the edge of the road, bent double in the dark, and wept convulsively. Eirik stood still, leaning against his horse, and waited. At last he went over, took her by the hand and raised her. "Now you must weep no more, Eldred." Then they walked together across the marshes, home to the farm. The bay horse walked in front, and Eirik's dog followed at his heels. "I have made ready no food," she said when they had entered the house. "I did so yestereve. You remember you said maybe you would come home so soon. But it made me sick to see it standing there useless. Now I will go and fetch." Eirik watched his wife go with pensive eyes. As he supped and afterwards unpacked his saddle-bag, they spoke some words of his journey. Eirik said that his father had not received him too badly, but it had been agreed that he was not to move home to Hestviken at present. But no sooner had Eldred come to bed than she began to weep again. And she wept on and on. She wept under her husband's caresses. She fell asleep with her face against his shoulder and sobbed in her sleep, and woke and wept again. Eirik lay still and let her weep her fill. "Would that I had died," she lamented once, "before you met me." "You must not say such a thing," he begged her earnestly. "You must not wish you had died while you hated God and all men." "Yes, rather than that you should lie here, cast out from your heritage and kin. You are the one who was set apart for me from the first. From here I am come, and hither I was to return." Then he told her his dream of the bird-woman, Lehman. But next morning, when Eirik came in to his meal, Eldred asked dryly, "And did you hear anything of that sister of mine, Gunhild? What has become of her?" Eirik looked up. "No," he said, taken by surprise. "That I clean forgot to ask.